one thing to accomplish. Get that young girl out of there alive. That's all. I understand. I think you do.
Come with me as we explore the world of the unknown. A world that most are too afraid to look into. Welcome to Taboo, Matthew.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Taboo, Matthew. As always, I'm your host, Matt Sheets. Thank you to those of you that are joining us again. People that have enjoyed some of my other episodes. I know there's not many, but we're slowly, steadily cracking away at that. And an extra special thank you to anybody that this is the first episode you're listening to. I really appreciate all your support, and it means the world to me because, not going to lie, I like running my mouth a little bit. It's something I'm passionate about, and I just like learning stuff, man. I like going and researching and then coming and sharing that with somebody, even if it's, 2 or 3 people. I don't even give a shit. It's something I enjoy. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. It does mean a lot. This is episode 6. It is the second episode of what I call the Heroes episode, where I try to document somebody I feel is a hero. And this one is pretty near and dear to my heart, man, because it's about my red pill daddy, Bill Cooper, which a lot of people I've talked to about these subjects, he seems to be, at least a lot of people who got into this stuff around the time I did, 20 years ago or so. He seemed to be the one that awakened a lot of people to what's going on. Somebody I deem a very great man. As always, this is my disclaimer. Everything in this podcast was presented to me as fact. So for the purpose of this episode, I will present it to you as it was presented to me as fact. And this is intended for entertainment purposes only. The first part, as usual, you guys know the drill by now. I took right from the so-called official sources that our masters so graciously bestow upon us, namely Wikipedia, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and FBI.gov, among a few others for this particular one. So here we go. Milton William Bill Cooper was born May 6th, 1943, in Long Beach, California. Not much is really known about his early life aside from him serving in the Navy and doing at least one tour of duty in Vietnam. Bill claimed to have served in the Navy, Air Force, and Office of Naval Intelligence, but public records show him as only having served in the U.S. Navy with a ratings code of E5, Sergeant, which is a petty officer second class from what I gather. He's described as an author, radio broadcaster, and conspiracy theorist, which is a badge of honor, in my opinion, that last title, conspiracy theorist. That to me means they're trying to discredit you. From 1992 until his death, Bill Cooper recorded a radio show called The Hour of the Time from his home in the White Mountains of Arizona. He would send these recordings via cassette, satellite patch, or phone link to the radio station Worldwide Country Radio, or WWCR, in Nashville, where they would then broadcast those via shortwave transmitter. On one of the last few radio shows Bill recorded, shortly before September 11, 2001, he even claimed that Osama bin Laden would soon be blamed for a major attack on a large U.S. city. His advice at the time? Don't you believe it. It would be used as a justification for war. Immediately after the attacks on 9/11, Bill stated on, I believe on this same radio show, that the 3 World Trade Center buildings were a controlled demolition, and the U.S. would soon be at war with 2 or 3 countries. Some of these old radio shows can still be found on sites like Rumble. There's a few others. I was able to find a few of them. And I highly recommend when you got some time, go and give them a listen, because Bill was pretty far ahead of his time. Wikipedia cites a few sources that claim that Cooper's views were heavily influenced by John Lear and his story of alien collusion with secret governmental forces. In 1989, the two, Bill Cooper and John Lear, released an indictment against the U.S. government for aiding and abetting and concealing this alien nation which exists in our borders. Cooper and Lear's collaboration lasted for a few years, after which Cooper accused Lear of being a CIA plant. And a fun little fact, John Lear is actually, I started hearing about him, I think when I was listening to Coast to Coast with Art Bell. I think he was one of the ones that was really pushing the Bob Lazar story as well. So if you don't know anything about him, go take a look at him. He strikes me as a bit of a shady character, but as with anything, I'm sure he's got some good things to say that if you wade through, you can probably find some truth to. Now we're going to cover what I could find just real quickly on the death of Bill Cooper. In 1998, Milton William Cooper was charged with tax evasion and bank fraud. He then successfully eluded multiple attempts by different agencies to execute these arrest warrants. And then on November 5th, 2001, 17 Apache County Sheriff's deputies went to Bill's residence near Eagar, Arizona, to serve a warrant for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Allegedly, Bill had threatened some of his neighbors, some of the local residents, with a gun over a few different altercations. And supposedly the officers or the sheriffs nearby were just sick of this nuisance, right? So they went there 17 deep because, from what I gather, Bill was a known advocate for militias, and he was known to be armed, and apparently they thought he was quite dangerous. 2 officers dressed in civilian clothes attempted to lure Bill away from his home, where they believed he had a huge stockpile of weapons and ammo. Bill drove out to where the plainclothes officers were, which surprised the officers. I guess they had expected him to walk out there. Not real sure why. But this surprised them, and then that kind of, in their eyes, forced them to identify themselves as county sheriffs. Once Bill realized they were county sheriffs, he turned back to drive home and was surprised by the roadblock they had set up to keep him from getting back to his residence. Bill swerved around this roadblock, almost striking an officer in the process. As he got back to his house, he exchanged gunfire with at least one deputy as he ran from his truck to get back into his house. The deputy that he exchanged gunfire with was struck in the head 2 times, but I believe he did survive. And before Bill could get to his front door, he was shot multiple times by the other deputies and killed. Obviously, that's the official story. I would put in my 2 cents that they just kind of wanted Bill dead. And you'll see why. Now we'll get into some of the things I found that are straight out of the horse's mouth, right? These are Bill's own words. Again, I can't attest to how true they are, but these are the things he said. And some of them are pretty wild, so strap in. So Bill talked about his father's pilot friends. His father was part of the Army Air Force, I believe, before it was actually an Air Force or possibly the Navy. But he talked about his father's pilot friends sitting around telling stories of their accomplishments, as well as stories of UFOs. This is when Bill's young, right, in his formative years, so to speak. These experiences made Bill want to be in the military from a very young age. He joined the Air Force and was part of Strategic Air Command for 4 years as an aircraft missile hydraulic technician. He worked on B-52 bombers. While in the Air Force, he met sergeants who told him about being in crash recovery of crashed UFOs. And then after his time in the Air Force, he went into the Navy. As a child, he'd had chronic motion sickness, so that led him to volunteer for submarine duty. I believe he said he was really trying to overcome that, and somehow the submarine duty helped with that. I can't remember exactly the story, but after he volunteered for the submarine duty, he was assigned to the USS Tyru at Pearl Harbor. And while on port lookout, he saw a huge metallic disc the size of a Midway-class aircraft carrier come out of the ocean, tumble on its axis, and take off into the clouds at incredible speeds that he'd never witnessed. He then told his quartermaster he saw something in that general area, but he wasn't specific about what he saw because he didn't want to sound crazy, and I think he was still kind of in disbelief. Two of the others joined him on the observation deck to observe and kind of look in that direction and see what he had seen. And he said that same type of craft came down, tumbled back on its axis, and went back into the sea. Now, he claims when it came down and went back into the sea parted for the craft to enter, then crashed back together when the craft went into it, as if the metallic part of it itself never actually touched the water. And then he states that the craft, or multiple of that same type of craft, then repeated this same thing, going up into the sky, tumbling on its axis, coming down, tumbling back, and going back down into the sea for 10 minutes as all three of them sat and watched. He was then told by, I believe, the quartermaster not to talk about it to anyone. Once he got back into port, the Office of Naval Intelligence came and debriefed them and told them that they didn't see anything. And if they ever told anyone about what they did not see, it would mean prison or possibly even worse. Not immediately, but sometime after that, he gained special security clearance while training with Naval Security and Intelligence as an internal security specialist. He specialized in Pacific Area intelligence briefings under Admiral Bernard Clary. And he was attached to the OPSTAT office under Lieutenant Commander Mikado while waiting for security clearance. Eventually, he received top secret Q clearance with SCI attachment. Basically, that means that there wasn't one specific area that he had access to. He says he had access to whatever the admiral had access to because he was one of the ones that was writing up the briefings for the admiral to read, right, for Admiral Clary. And then he stated that as these more outside of known reality documents started coming across his desk, he started to see a new designation of top secret called MAGIC, spelled MAJIC. He also claimed that NSC, or National Security, I'm not sure what the C stands for, but the NSC Memo 5410 and 5411 created a group of 12 men called MJ-12 or Magic 12 to study this UFO and alien phenomenon. And there were even two other NSC memos, 5412-1 and 5412-2, to cover up for the reasons these 12 distinguished gentlemen were meeting regularly. As these magic documents started coming more frequently, he learned that these craft, of which he'd witnessed at least once, were extraterrestrial in nature, and that there were 4 known species of aliens that the government was aware of visiting the Earth at that present time. He also learned, in this time, he learned of an agreement between one race of aliens and the U.S. government. Some of the projects he listed that he had read about on these documents in this particular time. I'll list some of them off. He learned of Project Red Light, where the government was testing these alien craft. Project Plato, which was several attempts at diplomacy with these races of aliens. Project Pounce was recovery of crashed alien technology. Project Pluto was application of these technologies in our own secret space program. He stated he also saw plans of something called Operation Majority, which had the end goal of a one-world government, which also had some type of extraterrestrial information contained in it. Not sure what the two had to do with each other, but I would guess that there was a lot of things going on between those two, between the alien agenda and the New World agenda. Projects Grudge and Sign, which contained all the ET info up to a certain point, which was then moved to Project Aquarius, which was said to contain all of the known ET information from any point in known history. In an interview, Bill went over all these things that he saw at his time in the admiral's office, but he also noted that he wasn't sure if they were true or if they were feeding him this info in the hopes that he would go out and spread this to the public. When the interviewer questioned Bill why he decided to come out with all this information, Bill stated he had seen contingency plans labeled Majestic. These contingencies were based on a few things going wrong, namely the public getting too close to the actual truth of the alien activity, or getting too close to the actual truth or the alien activity becoming too much to cover up any longer. So they would turn the alien agenda into a false narrative. That means they would run, their psyops to convince the public that the aliens were something that they actually are not. He also claimed that the Eisenhower briefing documents, which were featured in UFO magazine and a few other pretty mainstream sources, were some of these psyops that were created to push a false narrative about the alien presence. Those things, amongst some others, are what Bill says convinced him that he needed to come out and tell everyone about all this. And his main message in that was don't believe anyone, himself included, and question everything. Do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Bill talked about there being many, many UFO crash retrievals, a lot of them involving alien bodies as well as live aliens. In some of these crashes, the UFOs were not damaged whatsoever. One of the speeches I watched, he said there were 2 crashes that were so important, the government will go to any length to keep them secret. Both of these crashes happened near Aztec, New Mexico, and the thing that made them so important is that in the debris or in the ships themselves, they found human body parts. He talked about the well-known crash in 1949 near Roswell, New Mexico. He claimed that the government had to keep the live aliens it got in a Faraday system, because if they could transmit electromagnetic energy, they would disappear through walls. He talked about in that Roswell crash, they found a live alien, and they named this being EB, which stood for Extraterrestrial Biological Entity. For the first year, EB had a tendency to lie and deceive, and it would only give answers to questions that might have what it saw as a desirable answer. When the question would have produced an answer that was not desirable, EB would just not answer it at all. And then in the second year, EB started to open up and give a lot of information that would later be compiled into something called the Yellow Book. But Bill was adamant that, again, most of these species, especially the grays, had just had a tendency to lie and deceive. So a lot of what they said should be taken with a grain of salt. And then in late 1951, EB became ill with an unknown illness. EB's system was supposedly chlorophyll-based, and it processed energy much like plants on our planet. So for the next several months after it became ill, a botanist named Guillermo Mendoza was called in and worked to try to save EB, but was supposedly unsuccessful. Also in early 1952, the government began broadcasting into the furthest reaches of space in an attempt to save EB. This was done, according to Bill, more to gain favor with this species than anything. But also around this time, the NSA was created through executive order as a means to decipher any of the communications received from alien species, as well as establish a dialogue with them. The secondary purpose of the NSA, which I think most of us are more familiar with nowadays, was to intercept and monitor all communications from any device on planet Earth. Bill states that the NSA was also tasked with communicating with the Luna base and all other secret space programs. He preached on a few occasions that I heard that the NSA was the granddaddy of intelligence agencies. I think we're made to believe it's the CIA in a lot of cases, but up until recently, they didn't even admit the NSA existed. And Bill said there was a reason for that, because they are the Mac Daddy. They're the ones that handle all the big shit. And the CIA is answers to them, even in a sense. He also claimed that the NSA is exempt from any law of the U.S. that does not explicitly name the NSA in the law, which would make a lot of sense because they seem to do whatever the fuck they want to do. So on the heels of all this new alien phenomena in the late 1940s, the secret powers of the world decided to form a new group that would be outside of the purview of national governments and kind of free from the scrutiny of the press. This secret society, who made its headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, became known as the Bilderbergers. And the Bilderbergers, according to Bill, became the new world government that secretly controls everything. And, I mean, anyone that's done any research into the Bilderbergers, I think that they would agree with that to some degree. Bill was of the opinion that the UN was made kind of as a front, as a joke, which, obviously, I mean, nowadays that's even more evident because anything they say, I mean, only these little weak third world countries have to obey, right? When they tell Israel to do something, they do whatever they want. When they tell the U.S. to do something, they do whatever they want. And also around this time, after the U.S. government's experience with EB, the government learned that aiming the radar at these alien craft would bring them down. So as Eisenhower became president in 53, they saw a dramatic increase in craft retrieval because they were just bringing down as many as they could using radar. And this led to Eisenhower believing that this would become an even bigger problem. So along with his Council on Foreign Relation buddy, Nelson Rockefeller, he decided to do what all bureaucrats do and create more bureaucracy. And this is supposedly when they decided to create that legendary secret group known as the Majestic 12 that we had kind of mentioned earlier in the magic documents. So around this time in the early 1950s, 53, 52, astronomers had been tracking two massive objects they believed to be asteroids. Quickly, they realized that these had to be steered by some intelligence, and there's no way they were just natural bodies out in space on some fixed path. In 1954, these two massive ships came into orbit around the equator, and shortly thereafter sent a landing craft to Holloman Air Force Base. These beings Bill described as being large-nosed gray-type aliens. A humanoid alien species had contacted the U.S. right before this and warned them not to interact with these large-nosed gray types. Nevertheless, Eisenhower, doing whatever the hell he wants, because that's just kind of what our government does, he decided to enter into a secret agreement with these large-nosed grays. And then supposedly they left one of their own named Krill, spelled Krll, who supposedly went by the title His Omnipotent Highness Krill. These Greys stated that they came from the star system of Betelgeuse, or Betelgeuse, or there's a couple different ways I've heard it expressed, but it's that red star that's very close to us. But again, Bill stated that he thought that was one of the many lies that they were notorious for telling, and may have in fact been from Mars. I'm not sure where he gets that. That might just be conjecture on his part. But after this first meeting and them leaving Krill, they arranged for a second meeting, which then took place at Edwards Air Force Base. This meeting has become well known in the UFO community, and there's whole videos and threads and podcasts all about it, and all about Eisenhower, getting spirited off in the middle of the night, supposedly for a dentist, and there's a whole lore to it. But at this meeting is where they signed a formal treaty with Krill, with Krill's people, and this made Krill the official ambassador between them. I believe I heard it called the Grenada Agreement, or Grenada Agreement, whatever. Okay, something else Bill also spoke about former Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. A lot of you, I think, are familiar with James. Right after World War II, he was a major opponent of partitioning Palestine to create Israel, and that made him the target of much hatred from this group pushing for this new world order. So he had some very powerful enemies. Bill Cooper claims James Forrestal was also pushing behind the scenes for disclosure on the UFO topic. And that, according to Bill, more than anything, led to James Forrestal being asked by President Truman to resign from his position as Secretary of Defense. After his resignation, Forrestal expressed to many friends and colleagues that he was being followed and that he believed his life was in danger. Due to all this, Forrestal was omitted, which Bill said in reality he was committed against his will, to Bethesda Naval Hospital for exhaustion and severe depression, among other things. On May 22, 1949, agents of the CIA tied a bathrobe sash cord around Forrestal's throat, tied the other end to a fixture in his hospital room, and threw James out of the window. The sash cord tore, and Forrestal plummeted 16 stories to his death. Officially, I believe they ruled it a suicide and said that Mr. Forrestal jumped to his death out of the 16-story window. Go figure. I believe we talked about Operation Majority earlier. Bill said when he was reading the documents on Operation Majority, he came to know what had actually happened during the JFK assassination. Supposedly, the intelligence community felt JFK was a threat to national security, which really meant that he was a threat to the New World Order. What made him such a threat? An executive order for the printing of a United States note that would destroy the Federal Reserve. He also refused to provide air support during the Bay of Pigs, ensuring that it would fail. He spoke publicly of disbanding the CIA or shattering it into 1,000 pieces and scattering it into the wind. He had ordered the intelligence community to disclose the truth about UFOs. Bill claims JFK's assassination was ordered by the policy committee of the Bilderberg Group, and then it was carried out by the FBI, CIA, Secret Service, and Office of Naval Intelligence. Bill was the first person that I ever heard publicly claim that the head wound to JFK was actually administered by the driver of the vehicle, William Greer, who was a Secret Service agent. Bill had supposedly found the film showing the driver shoot Kennedy in the head with a special air-powered pistol, and then Bill went around showing it wherever and to whomever he could. Bill was also a huge advocate for the Constitution of the United States, and he stressed on many, many talks that I saw that the problem is men from many different secret societies that had infiltrated our government at every single level. He talked about how he noticed early on at his time in the Office of Naval Intelligence that almost everyone there was a high-degree Freemason. He believed he was chosen for ONI, or Office of Naval Intelligence, mostly because as a teenager he was in the De Molay Society, which is the youth leadership organization of the Freemasons. When he asked his superiors about why everyone in naval intelligence seemed to be a Mason, they said it was because Masons were good at keeping secrets. What he came to understand, though, is that in order to be in an intelligence agency, you had to be a high-level Mason, or Rosicrucian, or Jesuit, or some other of these loosely affiliated secret societies. These are all fraternal orders whose allegiance is to something other than the American people. And that's why these people are chosen to be in the highest forms of these intelligence agencies. One of the talks I was watching, Bill talked about how the U.S. government in 1933 implemented the Trading with the Enemies Act. At the time, when it was passed in 1933, it exempted the American people as the enemy and put the U.S. under emergency rule. But then in 1937, they reissued the law, only this time there was no exemption stating that the American people aren't the enemy. This, in turn, suspended all the rights guaranteed to the American people under the U.S. Constitution. This led to Harry Truman in 1945 signing the United Nations Treaty, which was then signed by the U.S. Senate. Then they pushed through the UN Participation Act, and then in 1947 the National Security Act. All these actions created this veil of secrecy and intelligence that allowed them to begin to bring all this power into the UN and get that much closer to their one world government. Obviously, we've already talked about earlier how it was actually going to, these Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderbergers, and UN was just more of a front. You see, what happened is that they had learned their lesson after World War I in their failure to create the League of Nations. And they knew that they would have to do something drastic to be able to suspend the Constitution. And the financial crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression was this engineered crisis that they needed. So after they got all that done, and after 1947, they used the Cold War as an excuse for this massive military buildup, right? The Soviets and the Americans, they said, oh, well, we got to build up our militaries and start suspending people's freedoms because we're going to go to all-out war with this other superpower. And as everyone knows, they never really went to any war at all. They'd have little pretend conflicts, but nothing like they kind of implied. And then the Soviet Union and NATO, both really serving the same masters and working towards the same agenda, as I stated, they just went throughout the world bullying anyone who opposed this one world government, right? And that's why no one ever wins these wars and no one gains any territory. Right? They're just extinguishing the resistance to this new world order. He also talked about JFK signing the first executive order for FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which, as most know, nowadays it gives FEMA the power to completely take over everything in case of invasion by a foreign power or a nuclear attack. Well, that's what was written at the time, right? Subsequent presidents since have changed the wording to vague definitions, which actually give FEMA power in a myriad of scenarios. According to Bill, JFK's executive order was right after they started building all these giant underground cities and deep underground military bases. As an example, he brought up Mount Weather in Virginia specifically as a place where they have a whole unelected government in waiting, as well as a computer with a master warrant list of Americans that they deem a threat to their plans to abolish the U.S. Constitution. Something interesting to note is that FEMA actually got its start in 1803 after a series of devastating fires struck Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and has had hundreds of laws and acts added since to become this monstrosity that we know of as FEMA today. So while that was when FEMA started really gaining traction around JFK's time, it actually goes back much longer. Bill wrote a book which, in my opinion, is a must-read for everyone. It's got some pretty interesting things in there. The book's called "Behold the Pale Horse," and it's pretty famous in the conspiracy theory community. But contained in "Behold the Pale Horse" is this top secret programming manual called "Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars," and it was supposedly found in an old Xerox machine or something somewhere, and kind of made its rounds in the conspiracy theory community, and he ended up putting it in the book. But it's quite an interesting read, and I think anybody with an open mind should really give it a good read. But Behold the Pale Horse has been described as the militia manifesto, among other things. But yeah, it's definitely something that's worth your time. Honestly, Bill put a lot of information out. I mean, all of his radio shows, all of his talks he did. I could go on and on into many topics. I just wanted to cover some of the more pressing things he said. All right. But to save some time, I'm just going to very briefly list off some of the other things he said. He claimed that AIDS was a man-made disease used as population control. He talked about how they are using this climate change agenda, to push for the New World Order. He stated that the Knights Templar became the Freemasons or infiltrated them as such. He claimed the moon landings were a hoax. He stated germ theory was a lie. He preached against the ADL as a weapon of the New World Order. And one of the things that I think really lends him credibility is he had many attempts on his life. One of them caved in his skull, and one of them led to the loss of one of his legs. I believe he had a prosthetic there towards the end. But as a lot of people know, towards the end of his time, he really started pushing more. I believe he was always Christian, but towards the end, he really started pushing this Christian militia movement, and even was denying that all the UFOs and everything were extraterrestrial in nature. He started to preach that they were actually our technology and that they were lying to us about their nature. Take that for what it's worth. But one of the things I heard Bill say about this New World Order, or this secret cabal's belief, has always stuck with me. And it's one of the last things I want to talk about in this section of Bill's own words, right? He said they have a saying that goes like this: a nation or world of people who do not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence, and thus are stakes on the table by choice and consent. And I think that fits right into how they treat us. So now with that said, we're going to go into my favorite part, the opinion, right? Where I'm going to give you all my opinion. I think kind of going off that saying that he said comes from the Bilderbergers or the secret cabal, I think we need to define where we stand once again, right? I wholeheartedly agree that the majority of people do not use their intelligence, right? I think that's evident to anybody who's ever tried to have a real conversation that's uncomfortable with people in general. But to me, there's two main camps in that belief system, right? Do you think because these people don't use their intelligence, they are no better than animals, and it's okay for you to take advantage of them and do whatever you want? Or do you think that because they don't use their intelligence, that those of us that do need to look out for them and try to teach them? Or at least, look out for them. It's quite an undertaking, trust me, I know, to try to shepherd these sheeple. It really is. But I think the easy road is to use and manipulate them, and that's clearly what this power structure does. So again, we need to define where we stand. Are you one of those that just wants to be the wolf to these sheep, or do you want to be the sheepdog to the sheep, right? And we all know the sheepdog's job sucks. But I think that's the right thing to do, and I truly believe that's where we all need to stand. And if even the majority of us did that, I think the world would be a much better place. Obviously, based on this whole episode, to me, Bill's a hero, right? That's my opinion on the man. He stood on what he said, and he was direct and succinct in his thoughts and opinions. Many people are going to point to the fact that he had changed his opinions multiple times on multiple issues. I think that makes his case even stronger. The best of us will change our views based on new evidence, right? The majority of people tend to try to force reality into their viewpoint. And I think when faced with new evidence, Bill made it clear that he had been wrong in the past. But the one thing he always stood on, and the point he always drove home, was don't believe anyone, not even him. He said the only one you should believe is yourself. Do your own research. Come to your own conclusions. Because everybody's got a hidden agenda. As I stated earlier, I think Bill was way ahead of the curve. And that's why many, many people you talk to nowadays in the so-called truther movement will describe him as, as I did earlier, as a red pill daddy. The person who brought them into this kind of subculture, I guess you'd call it, of conspiracy theorists, for lack of a better term. He woke many people up, me included, which makes him all the more a great man. He was recording his radio show in the 90s, in the early 90s, which, in my opinion, is akin to what we have in podcasts now, the tinfoil hats, the ninjas or butterflies, things like that. I think he was the predecessor to all that. He was the Coast to Coast with Art Bell, just on a smaller scale. And I think that's why he was never as popular, right? Now, granted, it gives me some pause that he was in naval intelligence. He was obviously privy to them using bin Laden as a patsy before 9/11. And that's just one example of when he was talking about information that had to come from people well connected in the government and intelligence agencies. But we're right back to this discussion of how they sow confusion. Bill could have been putting out misinformation unknowingly, as he stated was possible. He could have been putting out misinfo knowingly. He could have been telling as close to the truth as humanly possible, right? But as with anything to do with man, especially something on such a grandiose scale, I mean, it's probably somewhere in a mix of all those things. But again, he's someone I consider a hero, so I believe his intentions were mostly noble. And with that, I'm going to stop yakking your ear off. I want to thank you all again for joining us. If you're a fan of the show or you like what you hear, share it, tell your friends. Find me on Spotify, Podbean, anywhere there's iHeartRadio, anywhere there's podcasts, really, besides like Apple and a couple others. I'm mostly everywhere. I'm on Rumble. I'm on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram. We're not on X. I got kicked off X pretty quickly, which is ironic in my opinion, but honestly, I don't plan on being on many of the bigger platforms for very long, right? I think if I ever do gain any type of popularity, I won't be on YouTube much longer. I would say probably most of them, besides maybe Rumble and a few others. But as of right now, you can find me everywhere: Spotify, YouTube, Rumble. So go like, subscribe, share, all those things. It's greatly appreciated. I do it for you guys. I really do. Realistically, I do it for myself. Like I said, I love doing this. Gives me something to do, keeps me out of my own head, and I'm learning things, right? And there's a nostalgia factor to it for me as well. But before we go, I'm going to leave you guys with a quote. Befittingly, this quote is from Bill Cooper himself. And yeah, it's a very powerful quote. And I think if we take it to heart, we can change the world. And it goes a little something like this. Like it or not, everything is changing. The result will be the most wonderful experience in the history of man, or the most horrible enslavement that you can imagine. Be active or abdicate. The future is in your hands. And with that, I wish you guys all the best. Love, peace, and chicken grease, my people. Be good, or be good at it.